So all those outward behaviors, we call them compensatory. In other words, they're there to defend against that more vulnerable, shameful side of oneself, which anybody who's suffering with these traits, or anybody listening who's treated somebody like this, they know that when there are moments of like what we call a narcissistic slight, a disappointment of any sort, even everyday separation sometimes can make them oscillate between feeling like they're on top of the world to feeling very vulnerable.
This episode is sponsored by TherapyNotes, therapynotes.com. Be sure and check them out, and be sure and use the promo code Gordon, Gordon, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. For the past 20 plus years, I've been working in the mental health field as a licensed therapist, private practice owner, coach, and consultant. And I've learned a lot the hard way, and I don't think you need to do the same. Hi there, I'm Gordon Brewer, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. Whether you're just starting out, expanding your practice, or looking for fresh inspiration, this podcast is here to support you in your journey. Each week, we explore the real-world challenges and opportunities that come with building and growing your private practice. From marketing and money management to ethics, client care, and self-care, we cover it all. You'll hear from leading experts, seasoned clinicians, and innovative voices in the mental health and allied health fields, all sharing their insights and strategies to help you thrive in your practice. So let's jump in and get to today's episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. This is episode number 415 of the Practice of Therapy podcast, and I'm your host, Gordon Brewer. So glad you've joined us for this particular episode. I had the privilege in this episode to interview Dr. Anthony Mazzella, and in many ways, this is kind of a podcast exchange. Dr. Mazzella, Anthony has or Dr. Anthony Mazzella, his first name is Anthony, has another podcast called the Narcissism Decoder podcast, and it's a podcast that's really devoted to helping people navigate dealing with people that have been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorders and various forms of narcissism in their relationships. And he reached out to me to interview me, just talking about on his podcast about how narcissism affects marriages and relationships and how to navigate all of that. And we'll be, I'm sure we'll be in touch with you when those episodes come out. But in this particular episode, I get to interview him and just talk about working with people that have narcissism or have been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. And I think you'll find it quite interesting. So stay tuned as I get into this episode with him. But also, before we get to that, if you are interested in doing some one-on-one consulting with me, I'd love to have a conversation with you about that. You can go over to practiceoftherapy.com/nothing. Actually, just go to practiceoftherapy.com and click on the button there at the top that says coaching and consulting, and you can find out more about that. And how I start with people is we just arrange a free 15-minute brainstorming call in which we talk about your goals and what you want to accomplish through consulting and just making sure it's a good fit for you. But love to have that conversation with you and love for you to reach out to me. So again, go check it out. And also, before we get to my conversation with Anthony, I'd love for you to hear more about TherapyNotes along with one of the members of our PsychCraft network.
Hey there, I'm Aaron Potratz.
And I'm Nathan Hawkins. If you don't know us yet, we're the host of the Shrink Think podcast, which bridges the gap between therapists and clients.
The Shrink Think podcast is proudly part of the Psychcraft podcast network, focused on helping people live more meaningful and productive lives.
Join us every Wednesday in our engaging, informative conversations and lighthearted humor to help you normalize and demystify therapy for those beginning or continuing their mental health journey.
We discuss everything from understanding styles of therapy to addressing conflict with your counselor, learning about attachment styles, and the fear triangle. We seek to run the gamut of topics to pull back the curtain and empower effective therapy.
If you haven't listened yet, you can find us at shrinkthink.com/podcast and discover other resources, including educational videos and fun swag at our swag shop.
Hi, this is Rachel, Gordon's podcast assistant, and I want to share the platform Gordon trusts for his own practice, TherapyNotes. TherapyNotes is the highest rated EHR, practice management, and billing software for mental health professionals. It's an all-in-one system for scheduling, notes, billing, and secure client communication. And if you ever need help, their 24/7 customer service is always just a call or email away. Their latest update, Therapy Fuel, uses AI to streamline documentation, generating progress notes, creating contact notes from client messages, and even summarizing client history forms, saving therapists hours every week. Are you ready to give it a try? Head to therapynotes.com, click Start My Free Trial, and use the code GORDON to get your first 2 months free. See why TherapyNotes is the most trusted EHR and the one Gordon chooses for his practice. Please enjoy the rest of the show.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. And I'm really happy for you to get to know today Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Welcome, Anthony. I'm glad you're here with me on this episode.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Gordon.
Yes, and Anthony has a podcast, so he's a fellow podcaster called the Narcissism Decoder. And so we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about that particular topic. But before we get to that, Anthony, as I start with everyone, tell folks a little more about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed.
Sure. So I am a psychoanalyst, which is a type of talk therapy where patients come in to see me anywhere between 1 to 4 times a week. So I've specialized more recently in my profession in narcissism. And I landed here because many years ago when I was working on my dissertation, I was in a dialysis unit. That's where people go who have kidney failure. And we recognized there was a big problem with what they call non-compliance, which means that they're skipping or shortening their dialysis sessions. For dialysis, they usually go three times a week for 3 to 4 hours of treatment. So it takes up a big part of their life. So rather than just listening to all the conflict between the staff and the patients, about how you're missing and you're not compliant, I developed an intervention study where I wanted to just sit with them. We had 2 groups, one who got usual care and one who got a psychodynamic intervention, which was me just basically sitting with them, Gordon, doing what you and I do best, right? Which is the talk therapy. And the whole goal was just to get closer to their subjective experience, what life was like, how they experienced living with dialysis. And what I learned is many of them were in denial, that they didn't really think they needed it. Or even if they did, cognitively, they knew they needed it, but emotionally, they weren't ready to accept the treatment. They would rather be off in Atlantic City gambling. It's far more exciting, right?
Right.
Listening to the staff tell you that you're non-compliant and you need to do something. You need to behave in a certain way. So that's how I ran into it at the time. I don't even think I fully appreciated the extent to which I was dealing with personality disordered patients, and in particular, narcissistic personality disorder. So that's what landed me in this whole field, because I really needed to better understand how to relate, how to get close, and, how to help these people.
Yeah. 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 So, I know I meant to mention this at the beginning, but one of the things that Anthony and I have done is I was on his podcast or interviewed for his podcast here in the last week or two. And we talked about it talked about narcissism in the context of relationships and just what I've learned, just clinically over working with couples, and particularly if there's one that has identifies having narcissistic personality disorder. But I'm curious, Anthony, as you think about it, how do you tend to define it? And we've got the DSM definition of it, but just wondering how you tend to think about it.
I'm so glad, and this is one thing on my podcast that I mentioned. I'm just telling your listeners that I was so impressed with the mature and sort of comprehensive way that you think about things, Gordon, and you're doing it already, because you mentioned we have the DSM, right? It's like DSM, I don't know, we're up to maybe 5 at this point.
Right.
And it's getting better, but it's limited in the sense that it looks more at what we typically call like overt narcissism. And it doesn't really take into account the whole structure. This is what we call the grandiose or the omnipotence, which most people identify. They know about that type of narcissistic behavior. So there's, the whole grandiose sense of self is very complicated, but I just want to mention that it encompasses both that overt type of, I need to be the center of attention, risk-taking, look at me, I need to be admired, but at the same time, it also includes that more vulnerable side. So all those outward behaviors, we call them compensatory. In other words, they're there to defend against that more vulnerable, shameful side of oneself, which anybody who's suffering with these traits, or anybody listening who's treated somebody like this, they know that when there are moments of like what we call a narcissistic slight, a disappointment of any sort, even everyday separation sometimes can make them oscillate between feeling like they're on top of the world to feeling very vulnerable. And then maybe sometimes they even end up over drinking, turning to drugs, masturbation, pornography, to the bedroom sometimes if they really collapse and they can't get out of bed or go to work for a period. And all that happens because the underlying structure, and this is just one way to define it, and I know it's very complicated, but we think that they have a very fragile sense of self, which means that their self-esteem is very precarious. And they're always trying to regulate their self-esteem. So you could see then how that omnipotent sort of attention-seeking behavior could work really well to sort of puff up their image and make them feel better. So that's, a very high level, I would say, way of maybe us jumping into it or just.
Right. Yeah. And so, one of the things I'm curious about is that a little bit of, kind of being honest here is that I think for a lot of people, we don't find narcissistic people necessarily always that fun to be around. And maybe even, I think for a lot of us, I know even in my grad school days, when I was learning about personality disorders, it was kind of like, okay, these are things that are just hard to treat and hard to deal with. And so I think for a lot of us that are therapists, we think, oh, I don't want to work with these kinds of folks or that sort of thing. But you've kind of found a way to kind of connect with folks that are kind of meet those kind of criteria for having narcissistic tendencies. So what is it that you've kind of learned along the way around connecting with those folks?
Yeah, this is, I would say, in my mind, there are, again, many different pieces to this, but if I had to sort of list them in importance, this would be the number one important thing. And this goes for anybody who's treating them or anyone who's listening to this who maybe feels like they're in a relationship with somebody like this and if trying to figure out how to negotiate that type of relationship, is appreciating the subjectively useful component of something that's maladaptive. But let me break that down, okay?
Right.
So we say it's a defensive posture. I said it was compensatory. So if you could appreciate that if they're, they know it all, or they're arrogant, or sometimes they're critical or condescending, They're oftentimes very dismissive, like, I don't need you, because they know everything. So why would they need you? Appreciating that, what I mean is that that's part of the structure that holds them together. And if you can appreciate that, immediately your defenses will go down, Gordon, if that makes sense, because it's not just that they're doing this to you because you're incompetent or not capable, but it's that that's what makes them feel better. That's what they need to survive. So the goal, initially at least, before we get deeper into the work, is appreciating that by way of what we call containment. And that's just a fancy word, but that means that you want to get as close as possible to their experience. Like that's what I was doing with those dialysis patients that I mentioned earlier.
Right.
Really trying to understand, not telling them what to do, not educating them on why they need to be on their dialysis and not skip the treatments. So it wasn't about education. It wasn't about ever telling them what to do, but it was about really appreciating how they choose to do it the way that they do, and then helping them understand how they come to those choices in life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's really just in therapeutic terms, it's really approaching, really kind of validating their experience. And even though we don't see the world the way they do, is really being able to just simply acknowledge that with someone. And that probably goes a long way in building that therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify one thing. I know you probably mean this, but for any of like your therapists that may be listening in your audience, so validation isn't just agreeing or just understanding. Like I call that like false empathy, like, oh yes, that must have been so hard, when your wife retired to the bedroom early, and she left you feeling so alone. I don't think of it that way. The way that when I say containing, it's like, what you're trying to do is take in their experience, right? And then what we call detoxify it. In other words, they tend to come in and complain. Let's just use that as an example. They like to complain and everything is everybody else's fault, which is very common with personality disorders. It's never their fault. It's always somebody else's fault. So what you're trying to do is you take that in and then what we call detoxify it. In other words, you want to give it back to them in a language, in words. Like this is the development of what we call verbal language, which they don't have because they can't express feelings because again, they're so defended against that. So what we do is we take it in, we ask inquisitive questions to get as close as possible and try to understand it from their perspective. And then we could give it back to them in a way that we call, I'm just using sort of Beyond's language, that's a psychoanalyst, detoxified, in other words, in a way that makes sense to them. Now they can begin to get into a more regulated state of mind and begin to think about another side of themselves, which again, I mentioned earlier, is that more vulnerable or shame side that they're not always in touch with, because that's typically what we call split off. It like disappears because all you see is that more, if this is the kind of narcissism, that more grandiose presentation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what have you found that helps kind of create a catalyst for change for folks that are, working through this kind of, personality disorders or narcissism, that kind of thing?
So one of the main things is, since they're not in touch with this other side of themselves, because it's like fragmented or it's split off, right? We call this integration. So in other words, we want to help them get more integrated so they could be exposed and begin to be able to tolerate and work through a whole range of different feelings. So this way they don't need to get rid of them. Like again, just to use the example from the dialysis unit, it was much more pleasant to be in Atlantic City. But also, like I say that to you, and I kind of smile when I say it, and I think you did too, but you could also appreciate at the same time that this way they don't have to feel any vulnerability. They don't have to feel ashamed. There's no thought about all of what it means to be living with a disability, that you are dependent on a machine and on the staff. And by the way, just as a quick side note, people with these characteristics have a very hard time being dependent on anybody or anything. Remember, because they know everything, so they don't need anybody. So one of the main, just to go back to your question, is helping them develop a more integrated, complex sense of self where they can let different parts of themselves in that have been defended against, split off, and projected their whole life. And then as they become more integrated, they don't need to get rid of these feelings. And getting rid of the feelings means then they don't need to be above everybody or act out in certain ways, like I mentioned before, maybe with drinking or isolating themselves or whatever they may do. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I know when we were having our conversation on your podcast, one of the things that kind of the flip side of this, besides the person that is being diagnosed with or has narcissism, I don't know, struggles with narcissism, I don't know the best way to frame that, but how it affects relationships and the people that are around them. And so, I think where we kind of left off in our conversation was just, and I think a lot of us have had these conversations with different clients, those of us that have been doing this a while, where you've got maybe a narcissistic partner and they're really trying to figure out, okay, do I stay? Do I leave? Do I, how do I navigate all this? And then also just their own, kind of the trauma of being in a relationship like that.
Yes.
So
yes.
Yeah. So I was just thinking that, maybe the question is, what are your thoughts on that? Those the healing on the relationship side.
Yeah, I love this part because I call it like low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's unbelievable how much progress you can make with these patients once you engage their curiosity, because oftentimes they do come in struggling in a relationship, but relationships are so complicated. They don't always see all of what's going on. And what I tend to do initially is I help them. If, like, let's say you're in this relationship and you identify, or you're thinking that your partner may be, have these narcissistic characteristics, and you're not ready to leave that relationship for whatever reason. You've been with them a long time. There are very genuine moments as well. Maybe you have kids or finances that are intermingled. So then the question becomes, how do you manage a relationship with somebody who you think has these characteristics? And a couple of things that I typically help them with, again, this is the low-hanging fruit that I mentioned, is the first step, if there are steps, is don't get caught up in fighting over reality, because reality is very complicated. And then you're just going to go back and forth and saying who was right and who was wrong and what happened 5 years ago when you did this. So the first step is not becoming caught up in reality, but trying to understand your partner. And this goes for any relationship, by the way. And these things just happen more naturally, I think, for people who are, maybe more neurotic, not personality disordered. So the goal is to understand. And we do that, again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but it's such an important piece of it, by asking inquisitive questions. So the same way I described that I work with these individuals who have these narcissistic characteristics, I always encourage the partners or the children, right, of maybe their parents have these characteristics, is to always take an inquisitive stance, to try to understand their mother, and why she says the things she says. Now, Gordon, I promise you, this stuff seems so simple, but I was just doing an interview a few weeks ago, and this woman spontaneously gave an example of a family dynamic. I just posted this actually on my podcast. And immediately I said, you're arguing with her over reality. Like, you went in and you're talking to this mother-in-law. That was the example, right? And you're telling her what the truth is, but you don't seem interested at all in understanding her perspective. So that would be the first place to start, is being curious, gathering information, and then checking with them. That would be, again, I'm not trying to give schematic steps, but it would be then you listen and then you check with them and say, hey, did I get this correct? So I'll just give a very simple example. Your husband gets upset with you, or if again, clinicians are mostly listening to this. A patient comes in and they complain about their husband, right, who gets upset because you overcooked the burger, right? Again, I'm just kind of making this up, but you overcooked the burger and they're yelling. So then the first step is to do what? To try to understand what's going on here and start to ask questions. And this is the same thing that I do. And what I find out is when you slow it down, you can say, tell me, what was going through your mind? So what happened? This is what I do, by the way, with patients. When they handed you that burger and you recognized it was overcooked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what you typically hear more often than not is they don't know me, or they didn't listen to the way I like my burger cooked. And now you see you're getting to something different. You're not staying at the manifest level of the anger. You're listening for the deeper emotions underneath the anger, which are what? That this guy blew up because he felt like he wasn't being heard. Now, I'm not condoning that behavior, by the way. We'll talk about that too, at some point, in terms of creating boundaries. But that's last, that's typically what you hear from the first recommendation is, well, you need to create firm boundaries. But my first step and second step is gathering information, checking in with them, and listening for what the feelings are below the anger. But look, I know there's a lot more to say, but let me pause and just see how this lands with you. And
One of the things, and this is a dynamic that happens even when in any couple really is that we can get into this dynamic of criticism and defensiveness. And once it goes there, then it just tends to escalate. I mean, as far as, like you said, trying to hash out the facts of the situation is not going to get you anywhere, because my facts are going to be different than your facts.
Yep.
Because my perspective is different from your perspective. And it's kind of like an example that comes to mind for me. It's just kind of like if I showed you the front of a book and I said, okay, what is this book? And you would probably read the title and that sort of thing. And I would say, well, what is the predominant color of the book? And usually there'll be some kind of graphic or whatever. But if I flip the book around and say, what is the title? You can't really know it unless you take the book and maybe start reading the fine print on the back of the book. But the truth is that if you don't know the title, or you said it doesn't have a title, from your perspective, that's correct because you're not seeing it. And so the truth of the matter is it's both sides of the whole of situations. And so when, and thinking about working with couples, is trying to be able to get them to a place where they can kind of see the other's perspective.
Yes.
And they, like you said earlier, get curious with their partner. And that keeps it from getting escalated or emotionally flooded, or however you want to say that. And that's a huge dynamic change for most people.
Looking for a Valentine's gift she'll truly love? 1-800-Flowers.com knows what she wants. For 50 years, 1-800-Flowers.com has helped guys get it right, delivering millions of fresh Valentine's roses nationwide with high-quality bouquets guaranteed to last. Right now, when you buy 1 dozen premium roses, they'll double your bouquet to 2 dozen for free. Valentine's is coming fast, so don't wait until the last minute. Double your blooms today at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
If you're not using Ironclad for contracts, you could be leaving millions on the table without knowing it. Every contract holds renewal dates, pricing terms, and obligations you can't afford to miss. But good luck finding them when it matters. Ironclad's AI instantly surfaces what matters, so you can act before opportunities slip away. That's why they're trusted by OpenAI, L'Oreal, and Salesforce. Find the savings hiding in your contracts at ironcladapp.com/podcast. That's ironcladapp.com/podcast.
I love that analogy you used, because when you said if you flip it around and you can't see the title anymore, it's like you have to read the fine print or something. Like you got to look, you got to delve into it, right? And that's very similar to what I was trying to get at, which is, what's the goal here? Do you want to get to know your partner? And I've heard this before. It's like, the other key is you don't label people. We're not here to label. So sometimes they'll say, well, he's a narcissist, or he's a covert narcissist. And I told them that. And it's like, okay, but the goal is to try to get to know him and not label him. But then they say, well, but it's true. He is a covert narcissist. So why shouldn't I use that language? And it's like, it's not helpful to use that language, because I could tell you, like, I'll stop them immediately because I know what's coming next, which is, you know it too. He's about to explode, because that's a very dehumanizing way to just, to talk to somebody. It's not a way to understand somebody by slapping a label on them. So that's another technique. Okay. So, I mean, Gordon, I could keep going, but I'll just say one more thing. Okay.
Sure. Keep going.
One thing, again, with couples that I find really helpful is to stay focused on the present and what we call process, not content. So in other words, don't go back to the past and what happened 5 years ago. Like, we have enough work to do right here in the moment between just helping the two of you begin to communicate without all these distortions, Gordon, that you mentioned earlier, right? Because everybody sees things through their own lens. And just so you know, people with people with personality disorders, unfortunately, tend to distort it. Their lens distorts things based on their own history and their own representations of people, based on how they've been treated in the past. So that's like, you got to deal with misinformation that's coming in. See, we have plenty to do right now. We have to contain, we have to get them regulated, we have to get them curious. Then we have to clarify or clear up any distortions that are going on in the moment. So you don't need to go back, not initially, at least in the beginning phases of treatment. You don't need to go back to what happened 15 years ago or 10 years ago. And by the way, it gets so distorted, like it turns into what we call a screen memory. It has layers and layers of fantasy over it that it's just so far from reality. It's not valuable to go back there.
Right. Yeah, that's that same approach. And I'm glad you said that, is that, in working with other therapists, particularly I'm a AAMFT approved supervisor. So I work with a lot of folks that are, working through the licensure process. And I think so many people get intimidated by just working with couples in general, because they're afraid of the content. And if you can take that content away and just look at the process and look at, okay, how are they communicating with each other right now? What is happening in the background? What is the, when somebody says this particular thing in this particular tone of voice, what's the response to that? And so you can change the responses. You can't change the content. And you're going to get down a rabbit hole of, like we talked about, is, the truth for both people is something different.
Yes.
And so, And so getting really focusing on the process of what's going on rather than the content.
Yes.
Is, I think, one of the most important things for people that are working with couples.
Yeah. Can I add one more? Because I'm so excited.
Sure.
The audience is a lot of, like you said, like mental health professionals, maybe, who are working in this field.
Right.
So another critical thing to do when you're working with these patients. I love this, by the way, Gordon, because I don't typically get to talk about this end of things, because it's always talking about relationships and people who are in these relationships with somebody, right?
Right.
But now we're talking about how we help somebody heal, or how we heal relationships. Another thing is, do not think about interpretation. And what I mean by interpretation is something that's out of their level of awareness, that they're not seeing, that's just too far away, making it conscious. So we call it making the unconscious conscious, like maybe making a link. So I'll give you an example. You get very upset with your husband when he drinks on a Saturday, Sunday afternoon and watches football. But then you give an interpretation. Well, I remember you telling me that your father drank, right? That kind of stuff typically upsets somebody with a personality disorder, because they're not necessarily in that moment of making a link between, this is my father that I'm upset with and not my husband. And it means nothing to them. And typically it just gets them upset with you. And they don't have that capacity to make those links. So another thing that I teach, therapy, because I also supervise and I teach, but one thing I help them work on, which is really hard, because I think therapists believe that they're supposed to be making like interventions or linking things together, going after the content like we described earlier. But what I encourage them to do is just stay so close in the moment and just say, tell me what happened that moment when you heard him rip open a beer. What went on inside of you? What was the immediate thought and feeling? And you'll help them get to, that historical stuff with their parents, if that's what's there and they're ready to go there. But I would always advocate not to force it. Just stay in the moment with them. That's where, you'll get the most bang for your buck.
Right. Yeah. And that's, and truthfully, that's the only place where you can effectively create any changes in the moment. I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah, when they get later into the treatment and they're developing more of a capacity to really slow down and reflect and then try to make connections and understand why they behave. Yeah, at that point, then maybe you could give that kind of interpretation where they're so close to it and and you feel like they could use it in a way, that's beneficial. But typically that takes a long time and sometimes isn't even part of the process. I think you mentioned it last time, Gordon, just the process of helping them mentalize. I think we spoke about this. In other words, to think about their own thoughts and feelings, but also somebody else's, like their partners.
Yes.
It's a major accomplishment. And people always ask, can you really treat a narcissist? Like, are they really, can you help them? Do they really heal? Well, heck, this is part of healing right here, to develop a capacity for mentalization and be more thoughtful about what Gordon is thinking. Imagine that you could think about how that's a major accomplishment. Sure.
Right. Yeah. Oh boy, this is fascinating things to talk about. Well, I know we've got to be mindful of our time, but I'm curious for you, Anthony, in just thinking about helping couples, just in this context of maybe a person is trying to figure out how to navigate through a narcissistic relationship and they are really thinking about, do I want to stay in this or not? And also being able to how they can set boundaries with the narcissistic person, because I think that's one of the things that's, I think important for just any individual is know how to create boundaries for yourself.
Yes.
But in just thinking with a narcissistic relationship, it becomes even more, I think, a little more of a challenge. So I'm not sure if my question is making sense, but just thinking about it in that context of working with the person that is maybe in a narcissistic relationship. You mentioned the low-hanging fruit of just really focusing on the present and that sort of thing. But what are some other things that you found that are helpful with those people?
So you mentioned boundaries. I could speak to that because I think what happens if you really put in the effort and you try, like all of what you and I are discussing today and in our last episode as well that we recorded, and nothing is really working, like and that's if you're really trying. And you're trying to be inquisitive, asking the questions, all the things we mentioned, right? And they're still very, let's say, disrespectful. I'll just give you, again, I love examples, just a very short one. I'm treating this fellow. He's a grown adult, but his mother's very involved in his life and his treatment, too much so. And for months and months, Gordon, probably almost like a year now, she would send me very abusive emails. And I would try to contain it and say, we're here for him and let's try to, work together to do what's in his best interest. And by the way, the mother is abusive towards me because her son is getting better. And when you have a covert narcissistic parent, they cannot tolerate the separation. So she needs to interfere in the treatment process, but that's a whole nother story. So finally I get to the point where I say to her something along the lines of, this relationship no longer works for me, right? So that's creating a boundary, but I'm not breaking it off, but then you put in a consequence. If you behave or send me one more abusive email, right, then I will block your email and you will have to only correspond with me through your son. And immediately her tone changed. Well, at the moment, at least, I can't predict what's going to happen in the future.
All right.
But she has become much more respectful because I don't think she wants to lose that relationship with me. But she needs now to contain her. Well, the boundary actually, the boundary helped contain her. So when nothing else was working and I could not contain her, and again, she's not my patient. I think I would have worked with her differently. But then I had to put that boundary. And the important thing about a boundary is you have to give the boundary, like, don't talk to me this way again, and a consequence. Like, this is what's going to happen. And I'm not blaming her and I'm not upset. I just say this relationship doesn't work for me. That's the emphasis. So she can't get upset and argue with me because it just doesn't work for me.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, I love that because I think it's, as much as anything, it's really, I think with boundaries is being able to have a firm no and being able to stick by that. And I like that piece too about what are the consequences if they don't, follow through on what you're requesting of them.
Yeah, and it's not that I'm punishing. I'm not humiliating this woman or punishing her. I'm just saying I can't participate in this kind of relationship.
Right.
It's like it's like the parent who gets so frustrated with their child and timeout doesn't work, and the child doesn't listen or they run out. At some point you may have to say, if you don't knock it off, I'm going to take a timeout. Really, put yourself in timeout, right? Instead of trying to control, trying to control your child. So I'm not trying to control this mother. I'm just saying this is the boundary. This is where I'm comfortable. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, this is just great stuff. And I guess we need to be mindful of our time, and I'm sure, Anthony, I'm already thinking out loud here, but I'm thinking we might want to continue this conversation even more beyond this episode. I know we will have available for people the recording that Anthony and I did together for his podcast and links to his YouTube channel and that sort of thing. And we'll have those in the show notes and that sort of thing. But Anthony, tell folks how they can get in touch with you and where they can find your work.
Sure. And just to keep it very simple, it's just drmazzella.com is my website. And if anybody goes to the website, everything is there. The podcast is there, the YouTube videos. I put out a lot of written content as well, like little blogs about all different issues related to personality disorders and narcissism in particular.
Awesome. And again, like I mentioned, we'll have links here in the show notes and show summary for people to access that easily. So, well, Anthony, thanks again for being on this particular episode. And I know for sure we'll be having more conversations here in the future.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Gordon.
Well, again, thanks to Dr. Anthony Mazzella for joining me on the podcast. And be sure and check out his things at drmazzella.com and also his podcast, the Narcissism Decoder. It's a great podcast and just a lot of great information. And it's a very specific kind of niche that he works with. But I think we can all learn from that. And again, big thanks to him. And there'll be links here as we mentioned, in the show notes and the show summary, so you can access all of his things. So again, hopefully you'll be hearing more from Dr. Anthony Mazzella because we did some recording together on his podcast. And so we'll have those links to those things as they come available. So anyway, thanks for joining me on the podcast, or listening to the podcast rather. Do take time to go over and check out TherapyNotes. They are the leading electronic health record system for mental health providers. They're who I use in my practice and absolutely couldn't work without them. They are constantly improving their platform. And one of the things that has just been a huge game changer is their development of Therapy Fuel, which is an add-on with TherapyNotes that allows you to use artificial intelligence to help you write and complete your session notes. And so that has been a huge time saver for me and the folks in my practice. And I know my people absolutely love it. So be sure and check it out. Just go over to practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes and use the promo code just Gordon, Gordon, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. So be sure and check it out. And also do take time to follow us or subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. So take care, folks, and we'll be back next week for another episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. You have been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free Private Practice Startup Guide at practiceoftherapy.com. And to find more great podcasts like this one, please visit the PsychCraft Network at psychcraftnetwork.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. And if you need help in these areas, be sure to find the right professional to help you with these things.